Welcome to SciTech Culture with Steve Kern Ben Warner, where we examine science, technology and culture in the 21st century. Visit our website at scitechculture.com.
Well, it appears that Zuckerberg's turning up the heat on his employees. I mean, it must be getting hot over there at Meta/Facebook, struggling to continually find their relevance or whatnot. We'll get into this in a little while, just some of the funniness and some of what we were talking about before in terms of where Facebook's sitting at the moment. But before we get into that, I did want to just quickly mention a couple of things. I've been testing the iOS 16 beta for a couple of weeks on the 13 mini that I've got. Not too bad. Some of my suspicions around having too much choice around the lock screen kind of bears out, but then I'm kind of simple in that regard. I don't need to be doing a lot of customization, but I will say at least they've given you the option to do that if you want to. And there's a couple of other nice little features in there. It'll be interesting because it's next month is we're due to get the iPhone 14, the latest model, and there's apparently some other features that is stealing from Android, if you want to call it, or maybe they're just finally catching up. Things like an always-on display and some other bits and pieces, and hopefully a faster port this time, which is actually something I'm kind of itching for at this stage. And it's just another example of that sort of incremental nature that Apple seems to be acquiring or seems to be employing over all this time. And one thing I did want to mention, which we were talking about before we got on, is about this sort of gradual move back to putting more function into the product after so many years. And this is not just iPhone, but across all of the products in general. If you look at the MacBooks, they've gone to more boxier designs and whatnot to incorporate more ports, etc., to move away from that sort of pure design aesthetic. Whether you want to blame Johnny Ive completely for that, who knows? But it's interesting that the Apple products seem to be taking on more of a functional approach as opposed to just a pure design aesthetic when they're considering how these things come together.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think all of us really celebrate a couple more ports on the latest MacBooks. They're good-looking machines, no matter how, or even if they become a little bit boxier. So functionality is where it's at in this day and age. And to be honest, even though you can get by, 2 ports really isn't enough.
Absolutely. And one last little thing, I'm going to have a bit of a whine now about Prime Video. There's a function where on the back end, Amazon must be scanning whether or not you're using a VPN, probably to circumvent regional blocks or something like that. There's a curious little side effect to this, is that it's not always great. So, for instance, I've now started to see a message pop up on the Prime Video apps when I'm connected to my home Wi-Fi saying, please disable your VPN to continue using. Problem is that I don't use a VPN the majority of the time. So I don't know why it's doing that. And I seem to see a lot of chatter in forums about this being an actual issue, but do you think it's actually easy to get a hold of Amazon to chase this up and fix it? I'm going to give it a go, but I'm not liking my chances at this point, in which case maybe Prime Video just has to, go by the wayside.
Well, that's one way certainly to get their attention. Cancel your subscription, and I'm sure they'll try and fix the problem pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so those few little things out of the way, let's get on to Facebook now. And well, it's not just Facebook that we'll be talking about. We're going to pivot also to another update on COVID too towards the end of the episode. But starting with Facebook, I was laughing my head off when, to quote the big Zuck on a conference call, he said to his employees, realistically, there are a bunch of people at the company who shouldn't be here, and part of my hope by raising expectations and having more aggressive goals and just kind of turning up the heat a little bit is that I think some of you might just say that this place isn't for you and that self-selection is okay with me. And in today's world, that to me feels very almost old school in its execution. You can imagine an old school CEO saying that, in most companies, maybe 20, 30 years ago. But in this day and age, that's sort of headlining stuff that sort of pops up out of nowhere. And regardless of what you think of how that comes across, it does kind of point to, I don't know, like, why did he feel the need to say that? Is Facebook in a good place in relation to that? What is he doing if all these people that aren't meant to be there, why are they there in the first place if they're really onto, running a good ship? It's very curious.
Oh, it is curious. I mean, I guess really to sort of understand this, we'd need to know what sort of benefits that a current Meta employee enjoys. Maybe it's something to do with the post-COVID world, and a lot of people at Meta are just enjoying themselves or don't appear to be as productive as they could, and I'm sure they keep tabs on that. Maybe they're not posting enough likes. Who knows? But the other side of this is that really surely that's just a bit of code for cost cutting, and by raising the bar, which seems strange to me, is he asking all of his employees to innovate or just work harder, and work harder doing what? There's not a lot in there to really decipher from that, but to me it sort of foreshadows cost cutting, and they're probably going to aim at some of the softer parts of the business.
I also just think from a PR perspective, it kind of plays to that general image of Mark not being the warmest or fuzziest of CEOs around the place. Now, having said that, plenty of tech CEOs and probably just CEOs in general aren't necessarily that anyway, but others are probably a bit smarter in the way they might choose to make themselves look, given that this was a public forum and there was going to be understandable backlash that eventually ended up in the media and was obviously reported. So whether or not he thinks about those things or maybe he just doesn't care, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because he's got he should have a very highly paid public relations team around him, which I'm sure he does, but by the same token, there would have been a reason for that message, which they would have justified within the team. I mean, maybe it's a message to shareholders that, is deliberately channeled through the company first to show that Zuck's in charge and he's doing his best to make that bottom line as, cheery as possible at the next report. I guess there's many reasons for that, but you're right. I think more generally it just sort of plays into that Zuck stereotype of somebody who just does things his way, and if you don't like it or that you don't even have to understand it, too bad.
Yeah, well, I mean, he is in a position where he's the major shareholder, and despite move after move to move motions at shareholder meetings to either reduce that or to put someone else in, he's got the voting stock to say no every time. So and just keep himself there. One other thing, just while we're on Facebook, and it was in the same call, from what I understand, is him telling employees that Meta would be competing directly with Apple when it comes to creating AR and VR platforms, which I thought was interesting. Apple in particular, because Apple have been, yes, they're slow in their release of updates to technology, and that's one of the frustrations that a lot of people have with Apple, is that, also one of the jokes maybe, that, the iPhone 14 is going to get an always-on display. Yeah, Android's had that for 10 years or something like that, and that's the kind of running gag. And when it comes to AR and VR, they've talked a lot about how interested they are in developing it, but they actually haven't released much to really sort of make a statement as to, in terms of what they're doing, aside from there's a LiDAR scanner in the phone, and if you open the IKEA app, you can see furniture in your house before you buy it, which is a nice little gimmick and a nice little feature, but it's not like a regular thing. Whereas, the big Zuck has obviously already done this big play and made this big announcement about the metaverse and creating this whole ecosystem for you to live in, which is a very different type of thing. I just don't see, I just wonder where the crossover is, where he's thinking with that, because to me, Apple might go into that space, but I don't think it's going to be coming anywhere near from the same direction than what he's already publicly advertised that Meta's going to go in. If anything, I would think the AR component where they augment, your experience with the devices that you're buying from them is kind of where they're going, and slowly building to it, as opposed to here's a massive ecosystem that you can live in. And that's the kind of interesting thing to me about that comparison and why he would think that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where, there's probably the weakness for Meta is that they're a software company. There's no hardware, and they will rely on the hardware that's in Apple, in Google, in Microsoft products, I guess, to actually facilitate whatever, Meta experience they think that they're going to create. But the reality is that I'm sure Apple and probably Google have already got a whole lot of Meta or AR or VR experiences in the labs, probably ready to roll out when it's not so gimmicky, when there's the rest of the world catches up. Neither Google nor Apple need to lead with a product that's not going to do particularly well because the demand isn't there, or it's not that well supported by business in terms of an advertising channel. So, they're probably just sitting on it. And because of that, Zuck's probably frustrated. He's trying to put in, specific and unique meta features into these products. But by the same token, Apple and Google can probably just put them straight into their hardware.
I think just one final thing before we move off Facebook is just wondering where Facebook is and where Meta is and where they will be going forward, because it's starting to become a bit murky. Facebook was the $1 billion idea as popularized by the social network. It was the once in a generation idea. And yes, he did well. He set that up well. But is all of this just reaching? Is it all just trying to grab for the next thing when he actually doesn't have another thing in the bag to pull out? Is Facebook his only real thing going forward? The other tech companies have diversified in many ways. Even Google, who 90% of their business is still search and ads, propping up the entire company, still make attempts, with technology to do some other things and have some, minor successes as well elsewhere. But I do wonder what the future of Facebook and Meta is, and is there a possibility that it might not be relevant at some point in the future?
I think there's every possibility for purely digital technologies not to be relevant in the future. I mean, the only hardware that I think Meta has would be the Oculus products. I don't really know, but they don't really have any other hardware, so they're purely a digital entity. And you're going to have to run that digital entity on somebody else's hardware until, I guess, we just put chips straight in our brain. So, and that'll be someone's hardware as well. So I don't know. We live in a strange world where a company 15 years old may be coming to the end of its life. Whereas in the past it might take a 3 or 4 generations, 60 to 80 years for something to become obsolete. In the modern age, I guess that could be 20 years. So I'm sure they're working on it at Meta. I'm not for a moment predicting their demise or anything like that, but it just shows you the pressure that even companies on top of their game in the modern age, tech companies, they're always facing threats of something new.
Absolutely. All right, let's change tack and just do a bit of a coronavirus check-in. We haven't done one, I think, for a little while, but we're going through a fairly big wave at the moment. I guess there could be comparisons to if you look at the last pandemic with the Spanish flu, that the third year tended to be like the worst, and we're getting the most cases, most deaths, all that sort of thing. There are myths around certain things I've noticed. And it's amazing how messaging changes the public perception of their approach. There was 2 years where, like Australia in particular, and I'm sure it was the same in many other countries, where everyone was afraid of the virus and what it was doing, and a number count of 700 in one day was stopped the presses and shocked everyone. Now it's like no one ever even thinks about the numbers that are coming in every day. No one thinks about how many people are dying every day from it. But there's also, I think, a general kind of lax attitude that I think has kind of popped in as well because of that feeling of wanting to be over it. So things like, it's just a cold now, so let's get on with it, kind of thing. It's like it's not as serious as what it used to be, or the idea that I've had it, so I'm good. Which the variants are, the new, sub-variants that are coming out are kind of playing havoc with that, with people getting reinfected multiple times now. Or even that I'll hang out for the variant-specific vaccine kind of thing. It seems that the change in the rhetoric and the thinking has I don't know how you'd call it. It's just interesting that it could change on a dime like that effectively so quickly, because it was only 8-9 months ago that people were still in the afraid stage, and a change of messaging has kind of changed everything back into the other direction now, to the point where people, I would say, have swung back to not being as careful as what they probably should be. And I'm not just saying that in terms of COVID. There's also just general sort of, how do you deal with the flu? How do you deal with with colds? Stay home from work if you're sick. All that sort of basic stuff that people have just kind of thrown out the window because they all feel like they're done with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think really what we're observing is human nature. Over the first 2 years, predominantly from the government and the health sector, we're well aware of the dangers of COVID and the need to restrict, the number of infections. And now, sort of, because we have had a vaccination program, although for reasons unique to COVID, it probably hasn't worked the way that we would have expected. And human nature is now that public are free and out of the box, so to speak. COVID is something that the bad effects of COVID are something that happens to someone else, and you can look at every disease or ailment of the human species, and typically people have that attitude, which is just natural human nature. It comes with benefits and it comes with disadvantages as well.
It'll be interesting. I mean, all common sense would probably point to the virus kind of going more mild over time, and then eventually we'll get a hold of it. But there's always a scenario potentially that a variant will pop up that makes things worse. And I wonder what would happen in society if it turned out that a more significant variant of concern popped up that caused damage, and how that would affect how people would behave and react to it. It'll be interesting to see how that happens.
I think, human nature would mean that people get pretty frightened pretty quickly if it really turned out to be, significant proportions of the population under significant threat. I think the interesting thing with COVID is that the vaccination program probably hasn't worked quite the way that we would have expected. With the amount of variation in COVID now, vaccines will protect us from serious, cases and hospitalisation, but it really seems to be struggling with protecting us just from catching COVID, which is really quite unexpected, I think. And, when you're down to 12 weeks for a booster, you start to realise that, we're probably doing our best from a public health perspective, but we obviously don't quite have the tools to defeat COVID yet. This will happen. Either a variant will come around that humans can grapple with and our immune systems can get on top of, and herd immunity comes through, or we get a new vaccine that tackles a whole lot of variants and negates COVID that way. But until then, we just have to be sensible. And as you pointed out, whether or not you get your booster shot maybe is one thing, but we should all be a little bit more careful about, the potential for being a vector for carrying and spreading viruses. And I think COVID has been a good reminder to society of that.
Absolutely. And I guess one last thing, the discussion around where the virus emerged from has popped back into the headlines with a new study showing that it definitely emerged from the Wuhan market based on more research or whatever. I don't think that, regardless of whether or not this study has merit or not, it's almost irrelevant in an environment where people are just going to believe what they believe anyway, and the lab theory always has an attractiveness to it for quite a few people in terms of and they're probably not going to shake their views of it, and I just wonder if they even if this study, despite its attempts to draw some educated conclusions from it, even if they had a smoking gun evidence of where the virus came from, it still wouldn't actually register for good chunks of the population.
I think you're absolutely right. The purpose of understanding where the virus originated is the purpose of science. It's for infectious diseases of the future. It's for understanding how the virus came about, how it spread, and what steps we can better take to protect ourselves. It's not about pointing the finger to a location, which of course is how some of the wider media treats this. So, it started somewhere. We need to understand why it started, where it started, and what steps we can take in the future to prevent other outbreaks like this. Unless, of course, the whole world really does enjoy the threat of a pandemic.
Well, on that note, let's hope not. I would think the fatigue factor is such that maybe in 10 years' time, and hopefully by then it's all behind us, maybe we can see it through a different light and maybe assess it for what it is, as opposed to the emotional reactions that we have to it at the moment because of the pressure that it's putting on everyone.
Exactly.
Absolutely. All right, we'll wrap it up there, Steve. So don't forget to check out our website, SciTechCulture.com. You can get all of our links and content there. You can subscribe to our YouTube and Vimeo channels, RSS feeds, etc. Watch us on any and all of your devices, and we hope you enjoy our website. All right, so that's it for this episode. We'll catch you next time.